Hi everyone, number one Marmaduke fan here, and this is the old copy of Ivanhoe by Sir Walter Scott that I read in high school. And I've pulled this out because in about a week, I will have been on YouTube for 1 year, and my very first video was me talking about the Akira Himekawa manga adaptation of Twilight Princess. And what I thought while reading that manga is this is the Ivanhoe story brought into the popular format of manga. So, for a generation of young readers, Link in the Legend of Zelda is their introduction to what the character of Ivanhoe was for an older generation of readers. Now, when I read Ivanhoe in high school, I don't think I understood half of what it was, but I was still riveted while reading it because it's sort of like the language itself is almost enough to make you bizarrely interested, even if you're struggling to understand it. And this version was illustrated by Edward A. Wilson. This came from probably like towards the end of the golden age of illustration, when I think the finest artists of that generation were all book illustrators, and then kind of with photography and such, then gradually the appeal of illustrated books faded away. So Sir Walter Scott is writing this in the 1800s, about the Middle Ages, King Richard I and Robin Hood, and the Norman and Saxon tensions. So he is part of the Romantic period of literature. And I love the Andrew Klavan show. He talks about the Romantics a lot. One of the interesting about the Romantics is kind of their peculiar place in history. So when Andrew Klavan talks about the Romantics, he will defend them from the charge that the Romantics are responsible for a lot of problems in society, that the Romantics de-emphasize logic and that they emphasize feeling over facts, if you will. So, but then Klavan will defend them and say what the Romantics were trying to do is they were trying to touch into something in the human soul that you couldn't describe with sort of cold, hard facts. And to blame them for our problems today is to be unfair to the Romantics. And I want to read this book again. I probably won't be able to read the whole thing in time for my YouTube birthday, so I'll probably watch the movie again too to refresh myself. But even just the introduction, written by Sir Walter Scott, I don't understand half of it, but it is so densely packed with information. This is a good illustration of what I've been talking about when I say the people in Comicsgate, it's way bigger than a hashtag. It's way bigger than a few SJWs, I don't know, not wanting butts in comic books or something. The arguments we're having are cultural arguments. And these cultural trends have been around for a long time. Like, human beings have always had a weird sense of humor. Human beings have always had different tastes for stories, and we've always argued about our stories, and we've always complained if we didn't like the stories that were being written. So Sir Walter Scott's introduction to Ivanhoe is written in this really kind of antique language. You sometimes have to kind of slog through it, but he is talking about really foundational principles to why one would make art and how someone should make art. And of course, you know, even though he has this really humble view of himself as a humble entertainer, he still writes at a level where he has very complicated thoughts and very complicated sentence structure. But he has a very humble view of the role of the artist. The author of the Waverley novels has hitherto proceeded in an unabated course of popularity and might in his peculiar district of literature have been termed l'enfant gâté of success. So pretty much what Scott is doing in this introduction is he's trying to answer the question why he, as someone who's primarily known for being a Scottish author, would write a novel about a very English subject. Richard I, Richard the Lionheart, and the Norman and Saxon conflict. And what he's trying to do is he's trying to make a case for why it's good for artists to stretch themselves beyond their comfort zone and enter a new territory. And he writes about the risks of this, that because you're unfamiliar with it, you might kind of like make things up, or you might try to exaggerate everything to make it more dramatic and fall on your face. And when he talks about things like painting and the other arts, what Scott shows is that he is very considerate about the arts generally. So he says of painting that, you know, a painter who has mastered portraiture, well, maybe they could master landscape, or maybe they could master another medium. But the writer in particular is not limited by their craft. So if it's difficult for a painter who's mastered oil painting to master watercolor, just because you've mastered one medium doesn't necessarily mean you can master another medium in painting. The writer who has mastered use of language, use of words, it's easier for them to adapt to a different kind of literature. So this is Walter Scott's justification for why he wants to flex his muscles in a new field of literature. And something that's really important about this is Sir Walter Scott sees the writer as having a duty to his reader, to his consumer. So so much of Comicsgate is because there is this cultural attitude that the artist is completely independent from the concerns of the customer, that they exist to create art according to their vision. And the consumer, well, either buys it or they don't, but the consumer has no rights or demands upon the artist's imagination or the artist's work. And what this is kind of a head fake. Of course the artist has to have, personal, individual love for the story they're crafting or the painting they are creating. But it is completely foolish to ignore the role of the customer throughout the history of the arts. And the author of a book we now consider a classic of literature, Ivanhoe, he had absolutely no problem recognizing the value of his consumers and of essentially writing for their pleasure. He then talks about some of his inspirations for Ivanhoe. And he'll talk about how I think it's like really important for him that you, the reader, understand where he gets his inspiration. So sometimes he'll go at great length, like telling you the whole ancient story of the king and the hermit that was the inspiration for his use of Richard I in this story, back to the ancient context. But he also talks about a play that he watched that he was not very happy with. So he watched Logan's tragedy, Runnymede, and he liked seeing the contrast of the Normans and the Saxons, but he did not like how the Saxons were portrayed in that play. So that got the gears winding of how it might be interesting to his reader to see a contrast between the Norman and the Saxon that takes into consideration their personality. So for Walter Scott, the Saxons are sort of down to earth, they're very plain sorts of people, and the Normans are very militant and high-minded and concerned with chivalry. And that's what Walter Scott wanted to convey in his romantic novel. He has this whole interesting section about choosing the name Ivanhoe and the title of Ivanhoe. So he gets the... I love this because every contemporary author could identify with Sir Walter Scott back in 1830. The name of Ivanhoe was suggested by an old rhyme. All novelists have had occasion at some time or other to wish with Falstaff that they knew where a commodity of good names was to be had. Like every single writer, you're going to babynames.com to get you a good baby name. So Scott picks up the name Ivanhoe from a little, comedic old rhyme. And he likes the sound of it because it comes from the age, the time period he's focusing on. And he names his novel Ivanhoe specifically because he wants to leave a big surprise for the reader about what the contents of the novel are. And he is worried about making sure that his reader does not come to his work with false expectations and false promises. So he talks about how if you were to name your novel The Gunpowder Plot, then the reader is going to have certain expectations, like I'd better see some gunpowder blow up, and I'd better see some plotting if your novel is named The Gunpowder Plot. And then if they don't have that expectation fulfilled, they will understandably be upset. The reader understands the nature of the amusement which he is to derive from it. In this, he is probably disappointed, and in that case may be naturally disposed to visit upon the author or the work the unpleasant feelings thus excited. So for Sir Walter Scott, if he had chosen to title Ivanhoe, like the romantic adventure of love and swashbuckling daring, and you then came to it with these high expectations and you were disappointed, Sir Walter Scott believed it would be entirely understandable for you to visit your wrath in a sternly written letter to the author about how his book failed to live up to your expectations. Sir Walter Scott doesn't want to give you false expectations of what his romantic novel is. He wants you to come to the novel kind of with fresh eyes and to derive pleasure from it. He is excited by the ideas of his consumers finding pleasure in his romantic writing. In such a case, the literary adventurer is censured not for having missed the mark at which he himself aimed, but for not having shot off his shaft in a direction he never thought of. Sir Walter Scott doesn't want to promise you something narratively that he can't deliver on. He wants to deliver the romantic narrative that he is promising to people. What's the romantic narrative? a view from a Scottish author of a time in England's history where there's this tension between Norman and Saxon. But he doesn't want you to come into the novel, feel unhappy with your purchase, and then yell at him for it. He cares about the consumer. On the footing of unreserved communication which the author has established with the reader, he may here add the trifling circumstance that a roll of Norman warriors occurring in Auchinleck MS gave him the formidable name of Fonteboeuf. Like, half of this I don't understand what he's referring to, but he tells you interesting little snippets. Like, he got the character Fonteboeuf, who is slightly less bad than literal cannibal Shia LaBeouf. I mean it, is a character in this novel. And so he just gives you a little factoid of where he got the idea for that name. He is kind of thankful for the success of Ivanhoe, and then he goes on a little, like, it's almost like Stan Lee talking to the customers if they're unhappy with something. So some people were unhappy with the ending of Ivanhoe because there are two girl love interests for Ivanhoe. There's Rowena, the Saxon lady who he loves, and she loves him. And then he meets Rebecca, the Jewess, and Rebecca is a wonderful character. I think Scott was kind of ahead of his time in being concerned for anti-Semitism and wanting to portray Jewish characters as like real human beings who can suffer just like any other human being. So there was a lot of love for Rebecca the Jewess, and people wondered, well, why didn't Ivanhoe marry Rebecca the Jewess, the more interesting character? Why did he instead marry Rowena, the slightly more bland, nice girl love interest? And what Sir Walter Scott says about the character of literature and the purpose of literature, it's my channel. This is a year's worth of my channel, down to one kind of slightly antiquated prose describing the purpose of literature. So I'm just going to read this last paragraph because this is so important and it underscores the importance of thinking about virtue in your storytelling. The character of the fair Jewess found so much favor in the eyes of some fair readers, he compliments his readers, that the writer was censured because, when arranging the fates of the characters of the drama, he had not assigned the hand of Wilfred to Rebecca. Wilfred is Ivanhoe. He's Sir Wilfred of Ivanhoe, rather than the less interesting Rowena. But not to mention the prejudices of the age rendered such a union almost impossible. So Sir Walter Scott is concerned about historical accuracy, even if a more romantic happy ending would be Wilfred marries Rebecca. The author may, in passing, observe that he thinks a character of a highly virtuous and lofty stamp is degraded rather than exalted by an attempt to reward virtue with temporal prosperity. So if he just gives Rebecca the happy ending everybody wants for Rebecca, he thinks he's diminishing the character, because the point of Rebecca's character is that she is a Jewess of high virtue. And he doesn't want to give you the false impression that virtuous people all get to live happily ever after. Such is not the recompense which Providence has deemed worthy of suffering merit, and it is a dangerous and fatal doctrine to teach young persons, the most common readers of romance, that rectitude of conduct and of principle are either naturally allied with or adequately rewarded by the gratification of our passions or attainment of our wishes. He doesn't want to teach young people that if you are virtuous, you will just get whatever little, box of toys you want in life. He wants young people to understand that being virtuous sometimes means you don't get the box of toys, and the bad kid gets the box of toys. In a word, if a virtuous and self-denied character is dismissed with temporal wealth, greatness, rank, or the indulgence of such a rashly formed or ill-assorted passion as that of Rebecca for Ivanhoe, the reader will be apt to say, "Verily, virtue has had its reward." But a glance on the great picture of life will show that the duties of self-denial and the sacrifice of passion to principle are seldom thus remunerated, and that the internal consciousness of their high-minded discharge of duty produces on their own reflections a more adequate recompense in the form of that peace which the world cannot give or take away. In short, virtue is its own reward, and virtue is of primary importance compared to material gain. And so he refuses to change his story to fix that, but he actually thinks that it makes the character of Rebecca all the sweeter if her love for Ivanhoe is not returned, that she is still a virtuous person, and that this is the key quality of literature, especially literature for young people. So this channel started because I read a Legend of Zelda manga and dimly remembered reading Ivanhoe in high school, and having this connection that Link is a retelling of that character. And then sure enough, even if you get through the preface of Sir Walter Scott's Ivanhoe, you will already have a more fully developed sense of what virtue is and the importance of virtue for children's storytelling. In contrast to that, we now have a comic book industry which thinks that, nihilist, tee-hee, life doesn't matter jokes, that is what kids just love. Kids can't get enough of, goofy characters saying that life is meaningless and nothing matters. Ha ha ha. This is, my gosh, what a great perspective from Sir Walter Scott. So even though I didn't understand half of what he was referring to about, the Scottish romantic literary tradition, this is still a fabulous example of an artist who is humble about his role because he sees his role as to serve the needs of his consumer and provide them a pleasurable experience, but still dead serious about the importance of his role in informing young people especially about what virtue is and what the value of virtue is. And he points to providence as justification for his worldview. Magnificent. Read Ivanhoe. Read Ivanhoe. I'm #1 Marmaduke fan. I love you guys, and I'll catch you later.